Nice to meet you guys. Thank you so much for making time to hang out with me today and talk about sharpening. Just to be prepared, I brought business cards here so you can bug me anytime. My email's on there, our work number's on there, stupid questions, whatever. Like, I'm around. I will answer them, I promise. And then I have some other like little handouts that we'll pass out as we go through this kind of thing, so you can follow along with what I'm talking about. And hopefully, if you want to take notes or something like that, that's cool too. When I teach sharpening, as I was mentioning earlier, the goal that I have is to impart to you guys an understanding of the fundamental concepts of what goes on in sharpening, the how and why behind what's going on, so that you have a way to critically think about what you're doing, recognize when you make mistakes, what those mistakes look like, and know what to do when you see those mistakes. And I think that once you have a good grasp of those fundamental concepts, then going out and practicing and doing it on your own will help you get better every time that you do this kind of stuff. Because, at high level restaurants, but really with any food, it matters to be able to work with good tools, to be able to maintain and care for those things effectively. So just in the way you don't want to work with like a dirty pan, you want to make sure your iron skillets and cast iron is well seasoned. You want to make sure your knives are in good shape. So this is how I like to structure my stuff. First, I'm going to explain everything to you guys. Then I'm going to show you what all that stuff looks like. Then I'm going to make every mistake that I can make so you can see what they look like. And I'm going to show you how to fix those things. And then if there are questions, there are things you want to go over, you have knives that you're not sure what you're doing wrong, something like that, bring them over. Let's take a look and try and figure out what's going on. And we'll go from there. Today, I'm going to focus predominantly on double bevel knives, which are the kinds of knives that you'll most likely be using here. But there are also knives called single bevel knives, which are predominantly focused on like Japanese traditional cuisine. It's pretty easy to tell what the difference is. When you look at double bevel knives, the sides look pretty much the same. The bevel might be bigger on one side, smaller on another side, but they look pretty much the same. But when you look at single bevel knives, the sides look drastically different, right? And so if they look different, it is likely a single bevel knife. If they look the same, it's likely a double bevel knife. Single bevel knives have different sharpening techniques that go into them. You have to pay attention to whether you're right or left-handed, much more so than you do with double bevel knives. But I would imagine that most of you guys are using like a chef's knife, probably like 99% of the time. And then maybe like a little paring knife for like, I don't know, the other 1% of the time. Unless you're just sitting there cleaning artichokes all day, in which that is flipped and you just, always with the small knives. So, cool. Let me do this. I'm going to pass this around for now. Go ahead and take one of these and then throw it down over here, and we'll just keep going through this stack of things as we go. So, when you are sharpening double bevel knives, when do you need to sharpen? Well, we talked about this a second ago. Pretty much when your knife isn't doing what you want it to do, that's a good time to sharpen. It's not that you have to pay attention to like once every 3 days or once every day or once a week or anything like that. Really, like when it's no longer performing the way that you expect, you're not getting the results that you want, it's probably the time that you want to be doing your sharpening. For me, when I was cooking still professionally, that was every day. I sharpened at the end of every day, and I had like a whole workflow geared towards maintaining my edge. But it wasn't about my knife being dull. It was about having a consistent level of performance that I could expect. So every time I pick up my knife, as I said a second ago, that I knew how it was going to work. I knew that if I cut potatoes now, and if I cut potatoes tomorrow, and if I cut potatoes at 11 or 5, I was going to get the same kind of performance out of my blade, and I was going to get the same kind of result from my cuts. And that matters a lot. I mean, literally all we do in kitchens is focus on consistency. Like that's the thing, right? Consistency of performance, consistency of food, consistency. So when your knife isn't working the way you want, sharpen it. Cool? So the first thing that we want to pay attention to before we even get started with sharpening our knife, we want to look at our knife and we want to kind of assess what's going on with it. It's really important, for example, that your knife is straight. If your knife is bent, any sharpening that you're going to do is going to exacerbate issues with that. You also want to kind of identify if there are any problems. Is the knife chipped? Is the tip broken? I don't know. Is there rust on it? Who knows? So we're going to look at our knife. There are a number of ways that you can look at your knife. Obviously, you just kind of want to take a cursory glance at it and see, like, are there chips? Is there rust? Are there scratches? What's going on? But for straightness, what I want to do is I'm going to line it up with one eye, and I'm going to look down the blade this way. And I can tilt it up slowly as I go to try and get a sense of how straight or not straight it is. And I'll do the same thing with the tip facing towards me. And then I'll do the same thing with the edge facing up and the edge facing away from me. And as I do that, I'll move my vision my focus rather, all the way down the blade as I go, and you'll be able to see, does it turn to the left, does it turn to the right, what goes on. Fixing straightness is not the easiest thing to do, so maybe find a professional person to do that until it's something that you start to feel comfortable with. In Japan, people use this for that kind of stuff. And so, for instance, we'll identify like where the curve begins, where the curve ends, where the apex is, and then we'll work with increasing pressure up to the apex in the opposite direction and decreasing pressure away from it until it's nice and straight. So checking for straightness is the place we'll start initially. So check that before you do anything else. So I've seen a lot of people start sharpening their knives. Maybe they like sat on their knife roll or like threw some shit on top of it in their trunk, and all of a sudden their blade is like this, and they're trying to sharpen it. It gets really messed up. You end up with like weird hook-shaped tips and all kinds of stuff. Once we're ready to sharpen, we're going to get our stone stuff set up. All right. In a complete sharpening setup, there are 5 things that you're going to want. You're going to want a coarse stone, a medium grit stone, a finishing stone, something to hold the stones in place, and something to keep them flat. All right. Some of those things are non-negotiable. For instance, no matter what you do, you need something to hold your stone in place. Here, I have an absurdly fancy setup that is really nice. You don't need an absurdly fancy setup. You literally need something that stops the stone from sliding around and positions you in an area where you have knuckle clearance. And that can be off the corner of your countertop or something that provides height like this. So like a damp towel or some cabinet liner or a little bit of newspaper. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as your stone's not sliding all over the place where you're trying to sharpen. And again, you have knuckle clearance. So if you're right-handed, sharpen over here. If you're left-handed, you pick the opposite corner. So no matter what you do, something to hold the stone in place.
Would you say,
Yeah.
If you were to sharpen, like if you need a quick sharpen or touch in the kitchen,
Yeah.
like any material that you recommend,
To like
or like a microfiber towel, or
to stop it from sliding around, I would do the same like with the cutting board. I just grab like a paper towel, stick it under my stone, and that way also it absorbs a lot of the mess that comes out. So like when you sharpen, there's going to be some swarf and whatnot. If you can absorb as much of that as possible and then throw it away when you're done, it just makes cleanup easier. It's tough to sharpen during service or in the kitchen because things are busy. There's a lot of like cross-contamination issues that can go on. For instance, right? So I mentioned that I sharpened every day when I was sharpening. I had like a whole workflow set up. So like when I was still cooking, you just worked all day. So I would like roll to the fish market at like 5 a.m. and I'd be at the restaurant at like 9, and we start prepping for lunch. Lunch service started at 11. I had sharpened my knife the night before, so I knew that from 9 to 11, I was good, right? I could use my knife and everything would be good. I kept a third pan near my station with the finishing stone that I could use for touching up quickly. Because my knife never got dull, I didn't have to go much lower than that, right? So like 10:45 would roll around. I fucking eat staff meal real quick, and then I would touch up my knife on my finishing stone, right? Then lunch service would start. I'd roll through lunch service like 11 to like 1:30, something like that too. I would touch up my knife. I'd prep for like another hour, getting ready for dinner, take like a break in between dinner and lunch service. I'd show back up at like 3:30, right? Now my knife is ready to go. I roll through until about 5:30, eat my staff meal real quick, and then, touch up my knife and go through service. And at the end of the night, I would sharpen my knife and I would do the whole thing over again. And so that way then I knew throughout the day, I was having good, consistent performance. For Japanese knives, because they're a lot thinner and harder than their Western counterparts, they're more fragile or brittle. And so using a honing steel with them tends to cause a lot of damage. So instead of using honing steel, having a finishing stone around made it a lot easier for me to maintain stuff. In general, like the reason that people come to Japanese knives, which we specialize in, is that they are a lot thinner and a lot harder. And cross-sectional geometry, how thick or thin something is the largest determining factor of performance overall. The thinner shit is, the more easily it moves through food. So when you cut a sweet potato or a butternut squash or whatever the hard items you're cutting are, when you have a really, really, really thin knife, it's going to displace less material. So there's less force required to cut. The knife doesn't wedge into foods. The cuts don't crack at the bottom. But the thinner it is, the more fragile or brittle it can be, the more easily it can be damaged. And as the steel gets harder, you can get much longer lasting edges out of your knives. But again, they end up being more fragile or brittle. So depending on the kind of person you are, you'll find the knives that work well for you. If you're like the get shit done person in the kitchen, you just go there and you're like fucking power through stuff. Get like a Forstner. Get something that's like tough and durable. Use good technique, like employ good skills, but find the knife that works well for your style. If you're sitting there and you're the most finessey motherfucker alive, get a really thin, hard knife. It will work better, right? All right, so that's my response to touching up stuff. So holding it in place, important. Keeping it flat, super important. Everyone has worked in the kitchen where they've seen the stone that looks like Tony Hawk fucking skateboards on that shit. It's really impossible to maintain a consistent angle on something that's so dished. So over time, what we do is we rub something on our stone, and we rub our stone on something that will help keep it flat. I use a diamond flattening plate, which is literally an aluminum base with diamonds embedded on one side of it, and I'll rub this on the surface of the stone, and that will help keep it flat. You can use like the sidewalk. Like I forgot when I was working in Italy, I forgot to bring a flattening stone with me, so I just flattened on like the steps leading down into the kitchen. So there's like a really polished section of stairs going into, to this day, like it's still there. It doesn't matter, sandpaper, whatever it is. No matter what you do, though, you need to keep your stone flat. It's very difficult to maintain a consistent angle and a good performance out of your sharpening when it's not flat. So, yes.
How often would you suggest flat stone?
When it feels not flat or when it's visibly not flat, that's usually a good time to do it. You can do it more frequently than that, but the more frequently you do it, the more you are wasting material. So, you want to weigh that. Like if you have really expensive stones, you want to waste material because that shit costs a lot of money, right? If it's like a thing you don't really care about that might flatten as much as you feel like you want to flatten, but it does take time, and we never have enough of that. Like literally, that is the life of being. You have this much shit to do and this much time, so consider that as you go. But anytime it looks or feels not flat is usually a pretty good time. So holding it in place, keeping it flat, right? The only stone that you actually need, like just the one, that's a medium grit stone. And that's going to be somewhere between 800 grit and 2000 grit. Right? The higher the number, the finer it is, like sandpaper. The lower the number, the coarser it is. That stone should take you from dull to sharp, get rid of like small chips and nicks, should leave you with an edge that's more than adequate for any kind of kitchen use. So if you have just one stone, get a medium grit stone, right? If you have two stones, get a medium grit stone and a finishing stone. Right? Finishing stones will be above 3,000 grit, but for the context of kitchen use, you want to be somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000. The higher that you go, the smoother the edge will feel, and at some point you start to lose edge bite. So when you cut thick-skinned things like tomatoes, bell peppers, eggplants, even like onions, the knife starts to be slippery feeling. You want to feel what's going on. You want to be able to dig in, and you want the edge to feel somewhat aggressive, right? And so that's why that range of 3,000 to 8,000 works well. If you prefer toothier edges, like if you like a lot more bite or you cut mostly tomatoes, that kind of stuff, stay on the coarser side of that. If you cut mostly ingredients that are going to be served or plated raw, stay on the finer side of that. The higher that you go, the smoother the cut surfaces will be, so you get like a really smooth, glossy look and texture. They oxidize more slowly, so like if you're cutting basil or cilantro or something that just bruises or oxidizes quickly, finer grit stones will help you have less of that as an issue, right? But you also have a trade-off with that bite. The benefit of the finishing stones, in addition to giving you that refinement, is they make the process of burr removal, which we'll get to in a little bit, much easier. When you sharpen, you're forming a burr on the opposite side. You sharpen it, and it flips over. You want to get rid of that little piece of metal at the end, so you have a stable, clean edge that lasts a long time. And finishing stones make that process a lot easier. They also make things shinier. It's nice. It doesn't really matter that much, but it's nice. Shiny things are nice. So medium finishing. The last thing that you should get will be a coarse stone. And it's funny because it's probably the stone that's the most important overall, but it's the one I would get last. Coarse stones will be anything under 800 grit, but usually for most people it will be around 400 grit. They're really effective for getting rid of major chips, dealing with when your knife is super dull, getting it to be sharp again, making your knife thinner again. They get stuff done really, really quickly. The downside is that every mistake that you make shows up much more quickly and in a much more severe manner, and that's why I don't recommend people get started with it, even though it's probably the stone that I use the most every day. I don't want to spend a lot of time sharpening. I want to get through it really quickly, so I use a coarse stone to help speed up that process. Cool? So, coarse stone, medium stone, finishing stone, something to hold in place, something to keep it flat. That's what you need. All right? You may also want some Sharpie, and if you don't have one on you, well, you're failing at your job. So just have a Sharpie. Sharpie will help you out in terms of seeing what's going on in sharpening, assessing mistakes. We'll get to that in a second. So once you have your stone set up, you may need to soak your stone. There are three main kinds of stones. There's ceramic stones, resinoid-based stones, and magnesia-based stones. They all have kind of different requirements. Magnesia-based stones don't require any soaking. So you can splash water on them and start sharpening, dry them off when you're done, you're good. Ceramic stones, they require soaking prior to use, and you'll soak them until bubbles stop coming out. Once the stone is fully saturated, you're good to go, and you splash water in it as you go. Resinoid-based stones are often sold as splash-and-go stones. They look like they don't absorb a lot of water. They work the best when they're permanently soaked, but soaking and drying them repeatedly causes them to crack. If you're not sure what your stone is, ask me. I probably know, or ask whoever you bought it from. I hope they know. It should be an important kind of thing.
Any preference on material that you recommend?
I think it depends on what you're looking for, what you're just like. If you need convenience, like say you're looking for a stone to like touch up in the kitchen, a magnesia stone's not needing soaking makes it a lot easier to just pull it out and like do your thing. Unless your chef is cool with you having a stone sitting in a third pan, I don't know. Like it depends on the kitchen, right? Ceramic stones tend to have a little bit more grip, a little bit more bite to them, so there's more tactile feedback. It's easier to feel what's going on. And resinoid-based stones tend to feel creamier and muddier, and they do a much better job at polishing. So if you're looking to make something look really pretty, they do a better job. Yes?
Do you know if king stones are usually what?
So the King 1000, the like red one, is a ceramic stone. The 6000 and 8000 are resinoid-based stones. And then they have a 300 that's a magnesia-based stone. So they produce all different kinds of things. Huge company, Matsunaga Corporation. They make a ton of stuff. But yeah, the red one requires soaking, and you'll see when you put it in water, bubbles start coming out. And the 6000 is like tan colored, usually comes on the combo stone. It's a resinoid-based stone, so if you can permanently soak that one, it will be really soft and creamy and smooth. But if you just use it as a splash and go stone, it will feel a little bit chalky and not cut quite as fast. Cool. All right, so body positioning. This is where we're going to start for our sharpening. So much like cutting, actually, the same body positioning works well for sharpening. When you stand in front of your cutting board or your sharpening setup, instead of just simply squaring off with it with your hips, you're going to take a step back with your right foot if you're right-handed, or your left foot if you're... Are there any left-handed people here? Cool. Are you the kind of person that translates stuff well in your head from right to left, or do you want to see everything left-handed as well? Like everyone learns differently, so I want to make sure that I teach it in a way that makes sense for you.
Yeah, I need to show.
Okay, I will show you then left-handed versions of stuff. So I like how everyone just points to him like this motherfucker.
Yeah, that
All right. All right. So for everyone else, you're going to take a step back with your right foot. It's almost like a fighting stance. Your body's going to shift to the side a little bit. And what it's going to do is it's going to create much better range of motion for your arm as you move forward and backward. Right. So the same thing when you cut stuff, by the way. Like when you stand this way, your cutting area shifts from the center of your cutting board to the lower right-hand corner of your cutting board. So now you don't have knuckle clearance issues. So even if you use like a really narrow knife, your knuckles overhang the floor. You don't have to worry about smashing your knuckles into the cutting board. Your arm has much better range of motion for cutting, and it's easier to look down on where you're cutting without being off balance, right? When you're like this, you're really off balance as you're cutting stuff. Your arm doesn't have the same kind of range of motion. So for you, you'll do the same thing, but you're going to be standing with your left foot back to the side. Same setup. And when you're cutting, you'll work on the lower left-hand corner of your cutting board, and now your knuckles overhang the floor. Make sense? So that's going to be our body positioning, right? When we hold the knife, we're going to pick it up, and we're going to use a pinch grip. So we're going to start, I don't know, like sometimes people don't understand what pinch grips look like, and they're all over the place. They're like back here. Pinch grip's going to look like this. You're going to use the pad of your thumb and the first knuckle of your index finger on the left side, and you're going to pinch way the fuck up here on the blade. And then your middle finger is going to wrap under this area over here. Right? So your grip is predominantly here. This gives you a little bit of rotational control, and then these are just staying out of the way. However, if you have a tendency to have like the Kung Fu death grip on your knives, like if you just squeeze the fuck out of your handle all the time, you can stick your pinky out, which looks really douchey and ridiculous, but it forces your grip to be much more relaxed, and having a relaxed grip will help you out with your knife skills in a pretty significant way. I think the more that you have like a really tight grip, the more that you're really trying to use strength to do these kinds of things, the less well it works. Cutting is a function of like finesse and technique, and so being loose and relaxed is really helpful with that. So pinch grip, right? Same thing. Yeah. Right, cool. Hey, like everyone learns differently. There's some people that are really good at translating that stuff in their minds, and there's some people that aren't. I don't think I would be the one to translate that stuff in my mind, so I want to make sure we go over it. All right. So from the pinch grip, we're going to move our index finger up to the spine, and we're going to move our thumb down towards the heel. And this is the grip that we're going to use when sharpening the right side of the knife. All right, so in your case, same thing, just the left side of the knife. All right, so we have our body positioning down, we have our grip down, right? When we sharpen, there are two angles that you want to pay attention to, all right? Angle of approach and angle of sharpening, okay? So angle of approach is going to be somewhere in the 45 to 60 degree range of things. And there's a reason for that. Our motion of sharpening is going to be straight forward and straight back. If the knife is being held where it wobbles in the same direction we move, it's going to be really difficult to maintain a consistent angle. By having a little bit of an offset, it's much easier to maintain a consistent angle. In addition, we get increased surface area contact. So more of the knife is touching the stone here than there would be here. So we can get through our sharpening a little bit more easily. And lastly, this is just not comfortable. Like, this is a really uncomfortable position to be in. This is much more comfortable for my body, so I want to do things that are comfortable. So that's going to be our grip, right? And our motion is going to be straight forward, straight backward on the stone. On the flip side, we're also going to start from a pinch grip, but this time we're going to move our thumb towards the spine and our index finger back towards the heel. And here we can't have that same angular approach because the handle is going to get in the way. So we'll start off perpendicular, but as we go, we'll transition back into that roughly 40-degree angle approach. All right? So body positioning, grips, all make sense. So I had you guys grab this little thing. This is what we're going to be doing in sharpening. Bear with me. I'm like a horrible, horrible, horrible artist. So all of the stuff that you see here is like not to scale and kind of shitty. I hope that they make sense. I will try and make sense of it. When we are sharpening our knives, we're usually starting from a place that's dull. And whether that's chipped or just simply dull, usually what it is the edge is a little bit rounded over. It doesn't come to like a nice, clean, keen type edge. All right? So what we are going to do is we're going to sharpen on one side. And we are going to do that until we form a burr. And a burr is that little bit of metal that flips over to the opposite side. So we'll be sharpening that side that's colored in red. And you'll see that a little bit of metal flips over to the opposite side. And that little bit of metal is called a burr. We want to make sure that we form a burr and that it's the same size all the way through from the heel to the tip of the knife, right? This tells me a number of things. One, it tells me that I'm actually sharpening the edge of my knife, which is the whole fucking goal of sharpening. If you're not doing that, you're already fucking up. Two, it tells me that I'm removing fatigue metal from the edge. So all day we're taking our knife, we're banging it against cutting boards, foods, whatever. The metal becomes fatigued, not so dissimilar from what happens when you bend a paperclip a bunch. We want to get rid of all the fatigued metal and expose fresh new metal that's going to get as sharp as we want it to be and stay that way for a longer period of time. And making sure that it's the same size all the way through from the heel to tip tells me that I'm removing the same amount of metal each place along the blade so that the shape of my knife stays the same over time. So if you have a big burr in one area and a small burr in another area, the shape of your knife is going to change because you're removing more metal in one area than another. So if you've seen someone that has like a little hook talon thing at the heel of their knife or like a bird's beak tip, usually it's a function of this kind of thing, forming a large burr in one area and a smaller burr in another area. So make sure it's the same size all the way through. When we feel that, so say I sharpen on this side, I'm going to feel on the opposite side, and I'm going to use my index finger and my middle finger, not my thumb. They're significantly more sensitive. And I'm going to run them up the side of the blade like this and over the edge, okay? Not just across the edge like this, sure as hell not towards the edge, and not laterally because those last two you will cut yourself. So up across the edge like this. And you'll feel it feels like just a little bit of something grabbing at your skin. If you're not sure, like if you formed a burr or not, keep going. Just keep sharpening until you're like 100% sure that you've got one and it's the same size all the way through. As you do this more, you'll get used to what that feels like, and so you'll be able to do smaller and smaller burrs and waste less and less metal. So like, in the beginning, not knowing what you're looking for, you just keep going until you're not sure what it is. This way, this will help your knives last for a longer period of time. You can waste less metal because you know what results you're supposed to be looking or feeling for in this case. So we'll sharpen on one side until we form a burr that's even and consistent from heel to tip. And when we've done that, then we'll switch to the next side, and we will do the exact same thing on that side. So in our complete sharpening setup, we'll do coarse, coarse, medium, medium, fine, fine, right? As we go through and we switch from coarse to medium to fine, we're going to look at what the edge looks like as we sharpen it. We want to make sure, like sanding stuff with sandpaper, that we're removing the scratches from the previous stone and replacing with scratches from the current stone. And we'll go through the entire process as we do that. And ideally, in a perfect world, the burr will be a little bit smaller at each step that you go, all right? When we've gone through that whole progression, we're going to have a little floppy piece of metal hanging off the edge of our knife. You don't want that there. I didn't know about this like kind of early on in my career, and so I would just sharpen it. It would get really sharp. It would feel sharp, and it would cut, hair and cut paper really well. But as soon as it hit my cutting board, my edge would fail. And the reason for that is that this little piece of metal is still hanging off the edge, and I need to do something to remove that so I have a nice, clean, stable edge. And so the last part of our sharpening is going to be about weakening the burr's connection to the edge, so making it as weak as possible, making it as small as possible, and then removing it. And I'll show you what that looks like as we go through this. So that is what this ridiculous little graphic here is trying to describe. Are there any questions about any of this stuff thus far? Cool. All right. So let's go to the next page, which I will pass out to you guys. So that's going to be this one. All right. So if you look at your knife like this, and you're looking at the shape of the knife from here, going from the spine towards the heel, you can see how thick or thin your knife is as it tapers from the spine to the edge. This is what I call cross-sectional geometry. And that's going to dictate like how easily something moves through food. So the thicker something is, the more it's likely to wedge. The thinner something is, the more easily it will move through food. Over time, as you sharpen, your knife is going to get thicker behind the edge. This always looks like the transformer symbol whenever I All right. So as as we sharpen, say like the edge was like this from here to here, and over time as you're sharpening, now it's over here and then over here. The more that you sharpen your knife, the more you work into thicker sections of the blade, the thicker your knife will be behind the edge, and the less well it will perform, especially when cutting tall, dense foods like again celery root, butternut squash, that kind of stuff. So periodically, what we need to do is what's called thinning behind the edge, right? So you'll sharpen at a much more acute angle than you would normally sharpen at, kind of like these green lines here, right? And that will help you then regain control over how thick or thin your knife is behind the edge. So for instance, if you're sharpening normally like this over here, when you're thinning, it's going to be like this, right? And you can look and see what that looks like, and you can also feel what that feels like by pinching the blade and running your fingers off to the edge. So you can feel like, does it drop off? Where does it drop off? Does it feel thick? Does it feel thin? Does it disappear into nothing? And this will give you a good idea of how thick or thin your knife is, but you can feel it. Like when you cut a potato, you'll know. Is my knife thin? Is it thick? Like instantly you'll know. So keep in mind that if your knife isn't working the way you want, what are the issues? Well, one, it could just not be sharp. Or two, it could be too thick behind the edge for what it is you're looking to do. However, the thinner that you go overall, the more fragile or brittle it's going to be. So I would encourage you, if you ever go around this thinning process, to not overdo it. Do a little bit, cut some stuff, see how it goes. Do a little bit more, cut some stuff, see how it goes. Until you get comfortable with what that feels like, and then you can do whatever you want, right? In a perfect world, you would do a little bit of this every time you sharpen. Like thin a little bit, sharpen a little. No sane person will ever do that. It's very time consuming, and your knife will look all scratched up on the side. It's a big pain in the ass. So in reality, just pay attention. See what's going on. When your knife isn't working the way you want, look at it. Try and figure out why it's not working the way you want, and then enact a game plan that will help it work the way you want. So if it requires thinning, do thinning. If it just requires sharpening, do sharpening. If the edge is wonky, we can reprofile. So that, you want to look at stuff and then make responsive, actionable ideas of how you want to deal with those issues. Make sense? Cool. All right. So let's go to the next one of these things. So this is essentially that same idea. This is not to scale. I got to redo this image one of these days. But instead of sharpening simply, one side and the other side and calling it a day, I'm just saying you want to keep in mind doing a little bit of the upper stuff, a little bit of the lower stuff. What's unique about this page, though, is that it shows the concept of a micro bevel. And a micro bevel is a really cool technique that you can use on knives that are extremely thin and or extremely hard. So if you look at the upper image there, there's like a little thing on the edge, at the very last little bit of the edge that's at a much more acute angle than it normally would be. If you have a knife that's extremely, extremely thin, and you love how thin it is because it moves through stuff really, really easily, but it chips on you all the time, or you have like cutting boards that are shitty cutting boards and it gets fucked up, a micro bevel is a way that you can maintain the thin cross-sectional geometry, but improve edge toughness and durability. So after you're done sharpening on your finishing stone, you go at a higher angle on one side, like 35, 40 degrees, just barely touch it. It should look like a thread or like a single hair, like really almost nothing. And then, deeper on the back side. And this will increase toughness and durability while maintaining thin cross-sectional geometry. I think people are often surprised at how much cross-sectional geometry matters. They think like, hey, if my knife is sharp, that's what matters. You can make knives that are blisteringly sharp, like split hairs in half. But when you cut a rutabaga, it feels like shit. So thin really matters. Having a thin knife that has a clean edge will cut better in a lot of ways than a lot of other things will. The same thing goes if your knife is really hard, right? But you don't want to make the edge less acute than it is. You still want to maintain the way that it's performing in general. A micro bevel is a good technique for that. I would not recommend using this if your knife is not extremely thin or extremely hard, because then you'll be sacrificing a little bit of maximum potential performance for nothing, right? In the case of it being really thin and hard, you're sacrificing a little bit of maximum potential performance for toughness and durability. So it gets you through the service. So it's, it lasts the day that you need to last, and it doesn't chip on you. Everyone's good? Any questions?
That micro bevel, would you shift it so that way it's not eating up always on the same
No, it
Bevel
should be
size?
so small. It should be so small that when you
That you
sharpen
won't-
regularly the next time, it's just gone.
Oh.
So you don't have to worry so much about it shifting from one side to the other. But that is an interesting concept. I'll get to that one in this next sheet because that does matter in terms of like edge apex. All right. So pass this one around. So there are a number of things we're going to go over here. One of the trickiest parts of sharpening is sharpening the tips of knives. I think a lot of people struggle with what to do at the tip, and you see all these kinds of crazy movements, like coming out like this, and all kinds of ridiculous stuff. It's really much more simple than that. And it turns out that sharpening the tip of your knife is a function of bevel consistency. So in this upper image here, you'll see there's like a red line and a blue line. The red line to the black line is just an idea of what your normal bevel might look like. And a bevel is the area that you've sharpened along the edge. And you see that it's the same size all the way through from heel to tip. The blue line down, that's the minimum amount that you would want to do if you ever thin your knife, right? So when you're thinning, you need to make sure that you're making contact with about 1/5 of the knife. You can do more. You can do 1/3 or 1/2 of the knife. And in fact, the more of the knife that you're coming in contact with when you do thinning, the greater impact you'll have overall. But if you do less than this, you're not really making much of a difference, so don't waste your time. All right. What's important about sharpening the tips, though, is you'll see the distance from A to B is the same, the distance from G to H is the same, and the distance from D to E is the same over here, right? In order for that to be true, that means that when I sharpen the tip of my knife, that little section along the spine from D to E has to come into contact with the stone. If it's not, there's no way that my bevel will be the same size all the way through, right? And so how do I make that happen? Well, it's really simple. On either side of the knife, the adjustment will always be lifting. Let me move this out of the way so you can see. I'm so sorry. You're going to be lifting up the knife a little bit and rotating back towards the spine a little bit. That's the only way that you get that part to come into contact with the stone. And that's true on either side here. So as we sharpen the tips of our knives, we need to make sure that at some point we're lifting up a little bit and rotating towards the spine. And I'll show you as I do a demonstration exactly what that looks like. But keep that in mind because then it's not going to matter whether you do some shit like this, or you do something else. The only thing that matters is you're lifting up a little bit and rotating towards the spine. Make sense? Same thing for thinning. You need to make the same adjustment, lifting up and rotating towards the spine. You want to try and keep that as consistent and even as possible. So the middle section here, I was trying to demonstrate what spines of knives look like when they have what's called distal taper. And distal taper is a term that means something starts off thicker and goes thinner, kind of lengthwise through the thing. If your knife starts off thick and goes thinner, normally speaking, if you maintain the same angle, your bevel will appear smaller in the section that is thinner and larger in the section that's thicker. But that's not what happens when we sharpen our knives. And I think it's really interesting because it means that the tips of our knives are often at a slightly more acute angle than the heels of our knives. And that helps the tips of our knives be a little bit more finesse oriented. And it helps the heels of our knives be a little bit more tough and durable for the rough kind of work that we do. So it's not that you're going to be exactly, let's say, like 15 degrees all the way through. It's going to be a little bit more acute at the tip and a little bit less acute at the heel. And in doing so, you'll have a consistent and even bevel size all the way through the blade. It's kind of a fun thing about, distal taper. People also talk a lot about edge asymmetry. They use ratios like 50-50 and 70-30 and 60-40 to express how people sharpen, especially Japanese knives, that aren't necessarily ground the same on either side. It was a really confusing subject to me for many years. And at one point I realized that I actually hang out with the dudes that make these knives and I could just ask them. So I did. And it turned out that much like when your family asks you how to cook, they gave bullshit answers to people because they just didn't want to deal with it. So like my family always asked me, like, how do I cook a steak? And the reality is it's a kind of complicated thing. Like we spend years practicing how to do this stuff. How thick is it? What cut is it? Is it tempered? Is it not tempered? What are we looking for at the end, right? Do I want to just sear it? Am I going to baste it the whole time? But no one wants to explain that to people. So you just like, hey, look, like 5 minutes per side, real hard, stick into the oven until it's like, whatever temp you want, pull it out, rest it, cut it. It works, it's fine, but it doesn't really explain to people what's going on, right? Asymmetry, the 70-30, 60-40 thing, does that mean that you're spending more time on one side and less time on the other? Is it a function of like the size of the bevels on either side? It's none of those things. None of the craftsmen that I've ever spent time in their workshop with measure the angles they sharpen at, or the amount of time they spend on either side, any of that kind of stuff. In fact, all they're doing is they're going to cut with their knife and see what happens and make a responsive action based on that. So asymmetry is going to be much like that. Ignore the 50-50, 60-40, 70-30. cut with your knife. Does it steer to one side? Does it steer to the other side? Does it cut straight? If it steers to one side, that means it's exerting more pressure on one side than the other. But you want to create more pressure, more surface area on the side that it's steering towards, so it exerts more pressure in that direction and cuts straight, right? So, for example, if my knife steers in this direction, I can spend more time sharpening on that side, get a larger surface area on this side. Now it exerts more pressure in this direction and cuts straight. If it steers in the other direction, I can do the opposite, right? I can do the same thing by adjusting the angle that I sharpen on either side. Or I can do some combination of spending more time and adjusting the angle. I just need to remember that if I adjust the angle, if I make it more acute, so the lower the angle is, the sharper my knife will feel, but the more fragile or brittle it will be. If I make it less acute, the more tough and durable it will be, but the less sharp it's going to feel. And so as long as I can cut with my knife, see how it works, and decide what I'm looking for performance-wise, I can then come up with a game plan that will do that for me effectively. Make sense? To answer your question about apex centering, so the apex is the part of the edge where it comes together. On some knives that are like clad, so they have like soft cladding on the outside and hard porcelain on the inside, you want to make sure that the apex of the edge is somewhat centered so that you're not shifting it all the way over to the side. The cladding becomes the edge, because then why'd you spend money on this fancy coarse deal? In those cases, you want to be mindful of how you approach either angle or amount of time spent on either side so that the apex is somewhat centered, when you're sharpening. That pretty much sums that stuff up. Cool? Any questions about this? I think it's a pretty simple subject, like once these things start to make sense. Cool?
You do use the same when you're honing, right? Whether you're steel or
so yeah, again, if
ceramic or metal.
Same deal,
So
right?
You angle.
Yeah, you want to be at the same kind of angle that you're sharpening at. And that's actually a good question. So when it comes to angles, there's no like right answer. Like it's not like you have to sharpen this knife at this angle and that's the way it works. Kind of like what I was talking about earlier. You just have to remember that the more acute that you go, the sharper shit will feel, but the more fragile or brittle it's going to be. And the less acute you go, the more tough and durable it's going to be. But there are safe bet ranges. So like for Japanese knives, somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees per side, it's a good place to be. You can be lower, you can be higher. You just have to remember what we were talking about a second ago. For German knives, somewhere between like 18 and 22 degrees per side is a safe place to be. And there are a lot of ways to figure this out. I'm lazy, so I just use my phone. There's like a little angle meter in here. You can just zero it out, look and see what shit looks like. But you can also just like use common sense, so like 90 degrees, 45 degrees, 22.5 degrees, 11.125 degrees. And you can kind of eyeball it from there, right?
Eche, pregúntale qué piensa de las cosas esas que venden como para meter y que practicas como la.
No, it's not useful to do that kind of stuff because then. Yeah, look, I don't speak Spanish well anymore, but I worked in kitchens, bro. Like, I think that it develops really bad habits when you do that kind of stuff, but that's what the next thing I'm going to get to is, and I think it will help you learn how to do that kind of stuff more effectively. And by the way, like if you have questions, feel free to say them in Spanish. I will do my best to answer. I just will have to answer in English because my Spanish is absolute shit right now. So I apologize for that. So, on that subject, this is what we're going to get to next. And this is where Sharpie comes into play. So, when you're sharpening double bevel knives, there are 7 mistakes you can make. Literally, only 7. Like, that's it. It's really not going to be that hard. And once you know what they are and how to recognize them, fixing them is as simple as just doing the opposite of that shit. The easiest way to see them is to color in your knife with Sharpie. And so you'll see here in this top image that the knife is colored in not just at the very edge, but like some distance behind it. So I use the Magnum Sharpies because they're really easy, but even with the regular Sharpie, just color in a little bit more. So you get like a centimeter and a half of sharpening, like ½ inch, something like that. When you do that, you'll be able to see 6 of these mistakes, right? Then there's one you have to feel for. The 6 mistakes are as follows. Angle too high, that means that you did this, right? Angle too low, right? Under rotation at the tip. So that means that you're lifting up enough, but you're not rotating enough towards the spine. Over rotation at the tip means you're going too far towards the spine, not lifting up enough as you go towards the tip, and lifting up too much as you go towards the tip. And they each show up in really distinct patterns. So if your angle is too high, it means you've lifted up too high this way, the spine relative to the stone, you'll see that the very edge of your knife has the Sharpie removed, but not the entire bevel. When you see that, and it looks like the second image over here, lower the spine a little bit. That's it. That's all you need to do. All right? If you do this for a long enough period of time, your knife will become thicker behind the edge, and it's not going to cut well. It's just going to start wedging in foods. Okay? If your angle is too low, that means the spine of your knife is too close to the stone, you'll see this third image down here. The edge is going to stay black, but the area behind it becomes shiny, right? You're not even touching the edge of your knife. So in that case, you need to raise up a little bit more so that you're actually hitting the edge of your knife, right? Makes sense? So like angle too low, make it higher. Angle too high, make the shit lower. Really, really simple. All right. And if you're doing angle too low, by the way, that is the same as thinning. So if you're trying to thin your knife, that's what it's going to look like. But if you're not trying to thin your knife, don't do that. The next one is under rotation at the tip. So that means that I'm not rotating enough towards the spine as I do the tip sharpening. You'll see that the bevel gets smaller as I go towards the tip. The long-term effect of this is you get like a bird's beak tip, so it looks like a little hook at the very edge of your knife. You don't want that. And when you see this, that means you need to rotate a little bit more towards the spine. Rotation will always be towards the spine of the knife. All right? When you rotate too much, the bevel gets larger as you go towards the tip, right? And that means that you're going too far that way. And if you continue to do that in the long run, you'll see that the edge will sweep up a lot towards the tip. And so all of a sudden you have to lift your elbow. Wait, it's cold, right? Freezing my ass off out here. All right. You have to lift your elbow up much higher as you're cutting stuff. Well, that's really inconvenient, especially for someone like me that's short, like that blows. So don't do that. When you don't lift up your knife enough, you'll see that the tip stays black, but the area behind it becomes shiny. And that's an indicator that you need to lift up a little bit more as you go. This, in the long run, will also develop a bird's beak type tip. It'll just happen a little bit further back from the tip. So you'll see like a shape of the edge like this. It's no good. And when you lift up too much, it's actually really difficult to see in the Sharpie because all the Sharpie will be gone. But what you'll start to see is that light will reflect up and over the tip of the knife. And over time, the tip just becomes rounded over. And so you have no more sharp tip again. And in that case, you want to not lift up so much. Consequently, if you fuck up the tip of your knife, either through this or by breaking it off, there's a really, really, really easy way to fix it. You want to grind from the spine of your knife, reshaping the tip. You don't want to touch the edge at all. By touching the spine of your knife, you never have to worry about edge sharpness. You're not making the knife thicker behind the edge. So on a coarse stone, you can literally sit there and grind there, or just come and bug me because I have fancy equipment that will do it in like literally 5 seconds. It's very easy to do. All right, so those are the 6 mistakes. And when you've done everything correct, you'll see that the Sharpie gets removed evenly and consistently from heel to tip. And so the last mistake, the one you want to pay attention to that you can feel but you can't see, that's going to be inconsistent or uneven burr formation. So that means forming a larger burr in one area and a smaller burr in another. And in order to check that, we're literally just going to sit there and feel all the way through our knife when we sharpen. Did I form a burr? Is it even inconsistent? If not, sharpen more in the areas that are weak and less in the areas that are strong until it's nice and even and consistent. Make sense? So instead of using the stupid fucking angle guide things, use the Sharpie. And then you develop muscle memory because when you use the guides like that, you start to rely on them. You start to expect that it's going to be there. And so you don't develop the feeling of getting used to that kind of stuff. Like imagine if you cook steaks and every time there was just a thermometer in there and you never had to like touch it or feel it or get used to the time. Like you would suck at cooking steaks, you know? So you have to develop like the feel of it. And that's why I don't like those things. But you can check stuff periodically, you know, like use it as a reference. Look at it, but just don't rely on it. Make sense? Cool. That's all the discussion stuff that I want to go through. So now I want to actually show you what all of that stuff looks like. And as I sharpen, I'm going to form a burr. And I'm going to make sure that you guys know how to feel for that and know what it feels like. So that when you go and do it at home, you know what the fuck you're looking for. Make sense? All right. Any other questions before I get started actually showing you this stuff? I'm going to use a medium grit stone to start because this knife isn't too fucked up, so I don't have to use a coarse stone. This one happens to be 800 grit, but you can use whatever, like a 800, 1000, 1200, 1500, whatever. Something in the range between 800 and 2000. My sharpening setup here, I have everything clamped into a base. I have my stone soak underneath, and it's at a somewhat downward angle. That's convenient for me, and the people I train with in Japan sharpen this way. You don't have to do it. It can be flat on the surface. It doesn't matter. I like this because I get better water control. Like the water goes that way no matter what I do, and it's a little bit more ergonomic for me. You also generally want to be a little bit higher than this table is. So I tend to sharpen like here what feels comfortable for me. This is a little bit low for me. Find whatever works best for you, right? So here we go. So you start off with my body positioning, right? I got my feet the way I want them to be. Perfect, exactly like that. Just think you're gonna like fight someone, right? Yeah, all right. Body positioning is there. Start from the pinch grip, index finger to the spine, thumb down towards the heel. 45-ish degree angle of approach, and like somewhere in that 10 to 15 degree range of things. On this hand, I'm gonna use 2 to 3 fingers, and I'm gonna use them tightly grouped. I want to keep them over the center line of the stone. So I'm not applying pressure off either side of the stone, but I want my fingers to be over the center of the stone so the pressure is distributed evenly over the surface of the stone. And I want them to be as close to the edge as possible without touching the stone. If you can feel the stone under your fingers, you're going to start bleeding. Like 100%, you're going to start bleeding. And it's not going to be that you cut yourself. You're going to just like grind away the fingertips, and then you're going to see like streaks of red. And you're like, what the fuck is that? And your fingertips will be oozing blood. Don't do that shit. So if you feel the stone underneath your fingertips, just move the shit a little bit further back from them. This hand is going to be responsible for pressure and as much as possible movement. I know that you think this hand is going to be the one that does a lot of movement. I want to keep this hand as loose and relaxed as possible so that you're not applying downward or upward pressure so you get even pressure over the surface of the stone. This hand is responsible for angles, angle of approach and angle of sharpening. So here we go. My fingers are down, forward, backward, forward, backward. Try and use the entire surface of the stone if you can. You don't have to go fast. You can go really slow. Doesn't really matter. All right. I'm going to use the heel of the knife and the side of the stone as reference points. So I know if I move forward here and backward here, I'm always 1 centimeter from the edge of the stone. And then as I move down, I will continue to use that as a reference point. So my motion is straight forward and straight back. For me, I find it easy to slowly crawl my fingers up the blade as I go. But for some people that feels uncomfortable or scary, in that case, sharpen a little bit, move your fingers. Sharpen a little bit, move your fingers. Don't lift the blade up as you do that. Don't worry about the number of strokes that you do in each area. It doesn't matter. What matters is forming an even and consistent burr. That's a measurable result you can look for. If you count the number of strokes that you're doing, you could apply more or less pressure. Stroke length could be longer or shorter. Who fucking knows? Paying attention to measurable things matters the most. So we go like this. When I get up to the curvy section for the tip, I'm going to start to make that adjustment, lifting up and rotating back towards the spine. Personally, the way that I like to do it is I slowly work my arm inside a little bit, and then on my backstroke, I lift up and rotate back, and I come down on the forward. You can hear there's like a swooshing sound at the end. That swooshing sound is the rest of the blade coming back into contact with the stone again. So I'm not just sharpening the tip. The reason I tuck my arm inside is economy of motion. When my arm is tucked inside, the only movement that I have to do to make that adjustment is a slight wrist rotation. That slight wrist rotation does the lifting up and rotating back towards the spine. That's much easier for me than doing it out here, where all of a sudden like my elbow and wrist and everything have to get into it. But if you want to do this, fine. Who cares? As long as you make the adjustment, lifting up and rotating towards the spine, who gives a shit? You can do it however you want, as long as you're forming an even and consistent burr and you make the adjustment to burr. All right? So now let's do this and form a burr that's even and consistent from heel to tip. And I want to make sure as much as possible that my fingers are touching everywhere along the blade that I'm trying to sharpen, because wherever my fingers are applying pressure, that's where the bulk of sharpening is going to take place. So I've sharpened this side, so I'm going to feel on the opposite side for a burr. And I want to see if it's even and consistent. It's not. But I'm going to pass this around anyway, so you guys can feel what that feels like. And you can feel that it's not even and consistent. And you'll feel where it's strong and where it's weak. So what I want you to do when I pass this around, hold it in your right hand. And with your left hand, place your thumb on the side that you sharpen. And with your index finger and middle finger, run them along the side of the knife up over the edge. And what you're going to feel is where the burr is formed, which is like from about here to here, it's the strongest. You'll feel a little bit of metal grab at your skin. And the parts where it's much weaker, you'll feel much less of that or none at all. Okay? So I'm going to pass this around so that everyone can feel that. And in the meantime, while we're doing that, if there are any questions you have about what we got so far, lay them on me so we can not waste our time doing this passing around. I think it's important that people feel this, though, because a lot of times people come and like, I don't know whether I'm forming a burr. I don't know what it feels like. I don't know what I'm looking for. I got an email from a customer in Toronto today about that. She's like, I spent like an hour sharpening my knife, but I can't form a burr. I don't know what's going on. And she's using her thumb to try and feel for a burr. Well, it's not as sensitive, so it's really difficult to tell what's going on. And you can try. Use your thumb and see what it feels like. You'll see there's a big difference in your ability to sense things. The other thing is that oftentimes people just underestimate the amount of time that it takes to do it until you develop angle consistency. When you're first getting started, you're going to be all over the place. Angle's going to be too low, too high, whatever. It's going to take time to form a burr. But when you're consistent with your angle, when you do the same motion, it's much faster. So for example, like when I sharpen a knife, it takes me like 2-3 minutes to sharpen a knife from start to finish because I'm very consistent. But when people are getting started, maybe it takes them like 15, 20 minutes. If you're spending like 30 minutes or more on a knife, some shit is going wrong. Like something is going wrong. You're doing something wrong. You're wasting time. Don't do that shit. You're going to waste a lot of metal. It's going to be a big pain in the ass. And also, like, who the fuck has like 30 minutes per knife to sharpen? Like, no one has that time. So try and then assess, what's going on with your sharpening so you can fix those problems instead of wasting more time doing something that's not really going to achieve the results you're looking for. By the way, we have like all the printout stuff over here if you want to grab extra copies of them. Yeah? Or over here rather.
Would you say going slower not guarantees you, but makes you have a more consistent
Not
angle?
necessarily. I think that each person has like a rhythm that works well for them. And I think trying to go too fast is going to fuck you up just as much as trying to go too slow, where you start to like overthink things. I found that music really helps me out with that. I find like music that's got a pace that I can work to, and I just stick to that. Ironically, it's a lot of like booty music and merengue, because that's the shit that has like the rhythm and dude. I'm telling you, like merengue is maybe like the best sharpening music ever. It's got like the nice pace. It's fast enough. You can like actually do something. But you'll find something that works well for you that's got like a nice, consistent, even pace that you feel comfortable at, where you don't feel like you're rushing, but you also don't feel like you're going at a snail's pace. Because when you do something so slow, it's really much more difficult. You start wobbling and moving and doing stuff. So try and do it at a pace that allows you to flow. That kind of the same as cooking, right? Like when you're cutting stuff or sauteing, you get into a flow state where you're not really thinking about what's going on. You just move. And you move at a natural rate that works well for your body. And then someone yells at you to move faster. Yeah. So, yeah, hopefully that. Were there any other questions while we're still passing this around? And can you guys all feel the burr?
Yeah.
You can feel it's much larger in the center part and then weaker at the heel and at the tip a little bit, right? So like in this case, now that it feels that way, I'm going to go through, I'm going to sharpen the entire side again, but I'm going to focus less on the areas that are strong and I'm going to focus more on the areas that are weak and try and even that out, okay? And I would encourage you when you do this kind of stuff, when you're coloring in with Sharpie, first of all, Sharpie and water don't mix well. So color this shit in with Sharpie and then let it dry for a second, like wave it around for a couple of seconds, right? And then sharpen it a little bit. When the Sharpie's been removed a little bit, you can't see what's going on, stop, dry it off, color it in again. Color it in so fucking much that you're sick of coloring it in. And just so that you have that constant visual feedback as to what's going on, right? Thanks. And then when you're done, acetone and a paper towel or cotton pad is the easiest way to take off the Sharpie. And if your stone gets loaded up with that stuff, you can flatten it or you can rub another stone on the surface to clean the surface of the stone up. But just having that feedback is really helpful. So again, was strong here, weak here, and here. So we're going to go through and spend time at the heel. We're going to gloss through the center, and then we're going to spend more time at the tip. But I'm sharpening the entire surface so that I don't end up with like weird faceting. Right? If you like pick it up and put it down and pick it up, you're going to sharpen it slightly different angles at each place that you're sharpening at. So all of a sudden you don't have a consistent bevel all the way through. Now I feel I'm going to do just a little bit more at the tip. And you can listen to the sound of your sharpening, see what it sounds like. Get used to all the kind of sensory feedback that you get from it so that you have some ability to sense like, hey, is it going well, not going well? Is it consistent? Is it not consistent? There are sounds that you get used to with it. All right, so now it's much more consistent even from heel to tip. So I'm going to switch to the next side. So again, starting from pinch grip, I'm going to move my thumb to the spine, my index finger down towards the heel. And I'm going to start here perpendicular to the stone because if I start this way, the handle gets in the way. It's a big pain in the ass. You could switch hands if you like to. So if you feel more comfortable doing that, feel free. This is just the way that most of the people that I train with in Japan sharpen. So again, if my thumb feels the stone underneath it, it's going to start bleeding. So don't do that. If my fingers feel the stone underneath it, they're going to start bleeding. So just pull them back a little bit. Same thing, straight forward, straight back, straight forward, straight back. And then as soon as I have the ability to clear that angle, I'm going to switch back into that kind of 40-ish angle of approach. As I sharpen the tip on this side, same thing, lifting up and rotating back towards the spine. But there are a number of ways to do it. For instance, you can step to the side a little bit and use kind of that same rocking motion like we did on the front, right? It's almost like a golf backswing. You can do small incremental adjustments. So like, for example, I'm sharpening here, and then I lift up a little bit and rotate back a little bit. Now I'm sharpening here and here. And I do tiny, tiny adjustments as I work my way all the way up towards the tip. There are a number of ways you can do it. It doesn't really matter as long as that's the adjustments you're making, lifting up and rotating back towards the spine. When I feel for the burr on this side, again, my thumb is going to go down on the side that I sharpen, and my index finger and middle finger are going to run across this way, coming up this way, not across the stone, not down, not laterally, up this way. And you should be able to feel that little bit of metal that tugs at your fingertips. You guys all felt that, right? Like everyone was 100% sure, like that's the burr, I got it. All right, so now I formed a burr that's even and consistent. on one side from heel to tip, and then I did the other side, and I did that all on my first stone. So I'm going to move to another stone. So now I'm going to pull out a finishing stone. And so if you were going through your entire process, you do your core stone, your medium grit stone, your finishing stone, same kind of way. So here I am, I got my finishing stone. Now I'm going to go through and do the front side again. I'm going to do it at the same angle, same shit that I did the time before. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to be looking also, did I get rid of the scratches from the previous stone? Or are they still on there? Lifting up and rotating towards the spine. And you'll see the sounds of stones are different. Like this sounds quiet, right? Finishing stones are much smoother. They sound smoother. Coarser stones are going to sound harsh. So, listen for it. Make sure that things are sounding the way you expect them to sound. I'm always listening for like the slight swooshing sound here because that's indicative of me getting the rest of the blade to touch the stone instead of just sharpening the very tip of it. So I want to pay attention to that kind of stuff. So now I look, scratch pattern looks nice and even and consistent. It's much shinier. And I can feel for my burr, and it feels even and consistent from heel to tip, and it's smaller than it was the first time I did stuff. Again, if you're not sure that you have a burr, like if you're sitting there and you're like, yeah, is it there? Just go more. Keep going until you're 100% sure that you have it. And as you get better at sharpening, you'll be able to do smaller burrs. But I'd rather you have measurable feedback that you can rely upon to make good decisions about what you're doing than to just kind of go through the process without knowing whether you did something good or bad. So now we flip it over, and we do the other side. Same kind of thing. And you see how my left hand always stays over the center line of the stone so that my pressure is always being distributed evenly. So if you want to do it in small sections, you do it, stop, do it, stop, do it, stop, and so on. Work your way all the way through. All right? Okay, so now I've gone through the whole process, but I have this little bit of metal hanging off the edge of my knife, and I want to get rid of that so I have a clean, stable edge that lasts well as I go through stuff. The way that I like to get rid of it is first, I spend time weakening the burr's connection to the edge and making it as small as possible, and then I remove it. Weakening the burr's connection to the edge, I use a motion called stropping. And this is something that you can use for touching up your knife too. So like we were talking about earlier, how to do the kind of touching up, just keep a finishing stone around. This is the motion that I would do in lieu of using a honing rod. I think that this works better because there's wider surface area. The honing rods, because they're round and your edge is straight, all the pressure you exert comes at a really small focused area because it's a round thing touching it. So it's just the tangent that makes contact. So all of the pressure ends up being excessive in that area. And it tends to cause microchipping on knives that are thinner and harder. Doing this motion won't. So you'll get a better quality edge and it's better for your knife's edge. So what we'll do is at the same angle that we were sharpening at, we're going to start from the tip here and we're going to go in an edge trailing stroke. So stropping is an edge trailing motion. Always, whatever direction you're going, the edge is the back of that motion. So edge trailing, edge leading, right? So here through, and then on the way back, same thing. I'm making my tip adjustment as I go, and there are a number of ways that you can do that. There's this like reverse J stroke. You can start here. You can come back this way, but you'll see for each of those motions, I'm lifting up and rotating back towards the spine like I would for the tip adjustment, and same here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this alternating sides and going back and forth. And what's going to happen is that burr is going to get back and forth and back and forth. And as I do that, little bits of it are going to get ground away, so it becomes smaller and smaller. But again, to use a paperclip as an example, like bending a paperclip back and forth a whole bunch, eventually its connection to the edge becomes weaker. So we want to remove it. It's easier to remove, and it doesn't cause as much damage to the edge for ripping a piece of metal off the edge. So there's not like a set number of these that you should do. I tell people to pick an arbitrary number between 5 and 10. Do that number of sets, and then feel both sides. Is there a burr? Can you feel it? If so, keep going. If not, then we can remove it. So I'm going to do this until I can't feel a burr anymore. All right, now I can't feel a burr anymore, and I want to finally get rid of it. Again, number of ways to go through this, but I use the blue sponge. The blue sponge is the easiest thing. I have them around all the time. The blue ones specifically because there's not abrasive in the backside. The green ones have a lot of abrasive, so it'll fuck your edge up. But this is just like extruded plastic. There's nothing else going on in it. And so I'll just go like this and swipe my edge across here. And because this is somewhat rough, it does a pretty good job at grabbing onto all that stuff. Some people like to do that on their jeans. Some people will grab like wine cork and cut through wine cork, hard felt and cut through that. Some people use the end of a cutting board. Don't do that because the health department will ride your ass about that forever. But whatever it is, something that will get rid of that burr. So you're going to do that. And then just to be safe, just in case I caused any damage, I'm going to go back and do maybe 1 or 2 more of these stropping motions to clean up the edge. So when you want to touch up your knife, go and do a little bit of stropping until it feels sharp again. Do a little bit of burr removal. Do a little bit of stropping and go back. Maybe you spend like 30 seconds doing that instead of the 10 seconds you would on your honing rod, but the edge will be better. You'll cause less damage to your knife and it will last longer through the course of what you do. And then once that's done, you should be in good shape. And ideally, you have something that is nice and sharp and feels good. And so, test in a number of ways. The best thing you can do is go cut food. But a lot of people in Japan will use the back of their thumbnail to test. And what you'll be doing is just take the edge and put it against your thumbnail and try and move back and forth a little bit. It should stick like tape. And that will tell you not only that your edge is sharp, but that it has an appropriate amount of bite. So when you go and cut thick skinned foods like eggplant and bell peppers, it digs into that kind of stuff. Cutting paper is all right. It just tells you like your edge is sharp. You didn't chip anything. The best, just go cut food. See what happens and try and get as much information about what's going on with your cutting. Does it move through food the way I want? Does it steer? How sharp does it feel? What the quality of edge is like? So that the next time you sharpen, you get to make a more informed, smarter decision about how you go about your sharpening process. Make sense? All right, so that is literally the entire sharpening process. Would you like me to show you what each of these mistakes look like as I make them, and I'll show you how they look in Sharpie for real? Would that be helpful? Cool. All right, let's do it. So, big fucking Magnum Sharpie. And again, you got to let this dry for a second, because otherwise it's just going to be like a mess all over the place. So, shake it around like a Polaroid picture. All right, so we're just going to go through in order like I have on the sheet here. We're going to do first angle too high. So angle too high, that means the spine of my knife is too high relative to the stone. And when I do that, you can see here that just that tiniest little bit of the edge got sharpened, right? But the rest of the bevel, which is much larger than that, didn't get shaped. So when I see this kind of thing, with just the edge, that means I need to lower the spine of my knife a little bit, right? Is that that's what you got going on? All right. And it's funny, like when it's explained, and then you're like, oh, that's what it's been. Because no one ever explains this shit. Like, you just kind of like go and you're like, what do you do? And like, you sit there in your kitchen asking every fucking person like how they should, but no one knows. Like, no one ever sat there and like learned some shit. So it took me years to like, yeah, I feel you on it. All right, so angle too high. Cool. Let's do angle too low. So that means the spine of your knife is too close to the edge. I'm going to do it in a different section so you can see. This is a really extreme example, but you'll see that the edge is still black and the area behind it is not shiny. Cool.
That's the motion you do though if you're trying to thin your knife, right?
Exactly. Depending on like how low you want to go. But yeah, that's exactly. Awesome. Cool.
I mean, yes, but would you change a lot the difference if the steels are different? Like if you were to do carbon steel or stainless?
Carbon steel or stainless steel doesn't make much of a difference for that. The biggest thing is how hard that steel is relative to what that steel's capabilities are.
What would you do? So more pressure, or is just an
No,
amount of strokes
you don't
that
want to
do?
apply a lot of pressure when you're sharpening. I should have covered that earlier. Thank you. Sharpening is not about like brute strength, and in fact, you really don't need that much pressure. So like the heaviest pressure I'll apply, if you sit there with the kitchen scale and you press down like 1,500 to 2,000 grams, like press that with your left hand and see what that's the heaviest pressure I'll ever apply. Most of my sharpening is somewhere around like 700 to 1,000 grams. And when I'm doing a lot of the stropping or finishing, it's close to like 100 grams. It's like really, really, really light pressure. And so you can use a kitchen scale to like check and see. I think a lot of people, but especially guys in kitchens, are just like, let me fucking power through that and like put all the strength. No. You don't need to adjust the amount of pressure based on the steel type. You don't need to adjust the angle based on the steel type. You want to pay attention to those things based on what's going on with your knife, right? Like, is it chipping? Great. Like, maybe you should be a little bit less acute. Is it like wedging in foods doesn't feel sharp? Maybe be a little bit more acute. There's not one right answer. Like, the way you cut's going to be different from the way he cuts or she cuts. And so each person will need to sit there and be introspective and say, what works well for me? What am I looking for my knife? And how do I enact a plan that does that shit for me? So I wouldn't worry so much about like steel types or any of that kind of stuff. I worry about your experience, like measurable things that you can sit there and be like, this is working, this isn't working. Cool. All right. Let's do angle. No, let's do under rotation at the tip. Cool. So under rotation just means I'm not going towards the spine at all. So as I do that, I got to do this a little bit better. As I do that, you can see that the bevel decreases in size as I go towards the tip. What's up?
When you pass to the other stuff, you need press less. No?
Like as you go from course to medium to fine?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. Ideally, like in the perfect world, you do a little bit less each time you go, but it's more important that your pressure just isn't excessive overall, and that you go through this process of like feeling you should never be applying like really heavy pressure. But if you're going to apply heavy pressure, do it on your coarser stone, not on your finishing stone, and that will help you then get rid of more metal more quickly. You can see it's smaller as I go, right? So in that case, then I'm not rotating enough towards the spine. I want to rotate a little bit more towards the spine. Are we okay on time for you guys, or am I fucking with the whole prep schedule? All right. So now over rotation means I'm going too far. I'm trying to really extreme example of this. All right, perfect. So here you can see that I've over rotated, so it starts to get bigger as I go towards the tip. And when you see this kind of thing, you'll see less, right? And if you do like really extreme, you can look back up around it. Yeah, that's crazy. And you can see it gets larger there. That kind of stuff. Rotate a little bit less. All right. I'm going to color it in again really quick so you can see the not lifting up too much, and then we'll do the lifting up too much thing. And this weather has been so whack lately, like with the rain and the cold and the like. It doesn't feel like California right now, you know? Like very Seattle-like. Thankful for the lack of rain right now, though. It was like wicked there. Do you guys have like leaks and shit over here?
Even in the living room.
Fuck, man. Like everything. My parents' house looked like it was raining inside.
That was a few years for us.
Dude.
New Year's dinner was raining inside.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
and then like this is all. Oh, you guys can cover this though, right? Yeah. All right. So I'm going to show you now not lifting up enough and then lifting up too much. So not lifting up enough, you can see the tip remains flat, and the area behind it just looks like my angle is getting lower and lower as I go. Right? When you see this kind of thing, you just need to lift up a little. Okay? Alright, lifting up too much is a little bit tricky because the Sharpie will all be removed appropriately, but I'm going to show you guys how to look for that one as well. It's really difficult to like intentionally fuck things up. And, like, like it takes a concentrated effort. All right, cool. So this is lifting up too much, and what you can see is the light starts to reflect up and over the tip like that. And if you look really closely, the tip even like that, so that's the side. But mostly, what you're going to see is the light starts to reflect up like this. See that? So that's a sign that you've lifted up too much. You don't want to do that, so lift up a little bit less. And then the last mistake, the one you can feel, that was the inconsistent or uneven burr formation. We went over that earlier when I passed the knife around for everyone to feel the burr. You guys know how to feel for that stuff, right? So what else do I need to go over? Coarse, medium stone. We talked about flattening. Anyone have carbon steel knives? Like things that can rust or be reactive with acidic foods? Yeah? All right. So that would be like single, but yeah, usually carbon steel. So there's a workflow also for dealing with carbon steel stuff. So if any of you guys are ever interested in getting carbon steel knives, because you don't know how to deal with that shit here, carbon steel knives will oxidize. So you'll see on them like patina development and also rust. The most important thing is that when it's not in your hand cutting shit, it's clean and dry, right? And if you're going to store it, you oil it, not with like animal fats or food-based oils. Like as appealing as it sounds to just slather everything with duck fat, use something else. Mineral oil works really well. Traditionally, people use, dude, I'm telling you, like this one motherfucker came in once and the knife was just like bacon fat. and I was like, I see where you're going with this, man. Like I feel you, but that shit goes rancid, dude. It's disgusting. Mineral oil is really good. It's available like every fucking drugstore anywhere. Traditionally, camellia oil is used. You don't have to be traditional. You just need something that is not going to go rancid and it's like a somewhat neutral pH, right? But when you're working with stuff, you have to keep in mind oxidization occurs. So that's the patina development, that coloring on the blade, but also on your food. You get color, taste, and smell change to the shit that you're working with. And the more acidic the food is, the more quickly that happens, the more violently that happens. So you'll set up your workflow in a really specific way. So you have your cutting board in the lower right-hand corner of your cutting board, or left-hand corner of your cutting board. You have a damp towel folded up. I use like kitchen towels, so I don't have cross-contamination. I can throw this shit away all the time. And then you have a dry towel somewhere nearby. Health department is not down with damn towels on your cutting board, so keep a sandy bucket near your station. You can toss this shit in there and you're like, I'm cleaning. Be clean. Like, don't be stupid. Be smart about what you're doing. As you're cutting, like cut, wipe, cut, wipe. The more acidic the food is, the more frequently you wipe off the sides of the blade to mitigate that buildup of acidic food and manage the reactivity. When you're done, wipe clean, wipe dry, put it down, right? If you are able to rinse off, if you're not using the foods right away, it doesn't matter. Just fucking cook with them, everything's great. If you're not using the food right away, and it's something that you can rinse it off before you put it into a hotel pan. If it's not something that you can rinse off, keep it as cold as possible while you're storing it. So you slow down oxidization. Oxidization is a chemical reaction. Chemical reactions are either endothermic or exothermic. If you keep them cold for oxidization, it doesn't oxidize as quickly. And so that will help make sure that your onions don't turn fucking black or brown right away. But if you're cutting like only onions and fucking pineapple and whatever all day, get a stainless knife. You're like, don't be stupid about it. But if you want to use carbon steel knives, they sharpen more easily or they take a better edge, whatever, you just like them. This is the way that you want to work with them. Make sense? And then I really like semi-chrome is a metal polish that I use for daily maintenance of that kind of stuff. But if you see patina that developed you don't like, or there's like light rust on stuff, instead of using a rust eraser or barkeeper's friend or some kind of abrasive, get some metal polish like semi-chrome or flits and some little fucking makeup removing cotton pads. Nice ones, not the cheap bullshit ones that fall apart. And just rub that stuff on at the end of the day. Obviously, clean the knife off with soap and water before you go and cook food with any kind of fucking chemical on it. But that will take care of like light rust and stuff like that. So you can maintain your knives looking nice and clean all the time. If you have a mirror polish knife, you can stay nice and mirror polished without scratching it. I think that covered everything that I wanted to cover for you guys. Ideally, I have a whole bunch of stuff on single bevel knives. So someone mentioned that someone has a Deba here. I don't want to waste a lot of your time, but if you have questions about that kind of stuff, I'm here. I'm happy to talk about them, show you, answer those questions. But also my business cards are here, as I mentioned earlier. Email me, call me, hit me up. I'm around. I'm happy to help. That's it. Any questions about any of the stuff we went over so far? What's up?
Depending on how you hit the knife, like the front or the back side of it, does your angle change at all?
So, it doesn't have to, but it can. We talked about earlier how to manage asymmetry. And the gist of it is this. Cut with your knife and see what happens, right? If your knife steers in one direction, you need to create more surface area on the side that it steers towards. And you can do that by adjusting the amount of time you spend sharpening on the other side or the angle that you sharpen on the other side or a combination thereof. And just keep in mind that the more acute that you go overall, the sharper the knife will feel, but the more fragile or brittle it will be. The less acute you go, the more tough and durable it will be. And with plaid knives, where there's soft steel and hardcore, keep the apex of the edge somewhat centered. Don't shift it so far off to the side. So if you want to sharpen differently on the other side, cool. But you don't have to. What you have to do is cut shit with your knife, see how it works, and then get it to work the way you want. Cool? Anything else?
So I think you already went through this, but if you drop your knife and the tip chips,
Yes.
you said
Repair it from the spine, right?
So
If you have a broken tip
backwards,
and you start to repair it from the edge, first of all, your knife is going to be thicker at the tip behind the edge than it would be, so it's going to cut less well there as a function of cross-sectional geometry. But also, this shit is going to swing up a lot. And as I mentioned before, I'm short, as you can see. I don't want to fucking lift my elbow up super high when I'm cutting stuff. It's really a pain in the ass. So what you'll do instead is start far enough back, but you'll just grind from the tip, or from the spine rather, to reshape the tip the way that you want. You can do that on the sidewalk, you can do it on a coarse stone, or as I mentioned, I have fancy powered equipment that helps me do that in a few seconds. Just come and bug me, and I will gladly help you out with that kind of stuff. But yeah, repair from the spine, not the edge. Cool?
When it comes to maintenance on your knives, do you always just recommend hitting them with like a stone, or maybe like once every 6 months taking them to a professional sharpening?
It depends on how dorky you want to be about it, man. Like, you should be capable of doing everything. And if you want to spend time and learn how to do that and have the equipment for that kind of stuff, my personal opinion is do the shit yourself, because it will help you develop the skill, and you'll also feel so much more comfortable with what it is that you're doing, right? The more you know how to do stuff, the less you're nervous about using things or making mistakes. And so I think that comfort really matters. But if there's something that's beyond your ability, yeah, find a professional. Let them help you out with stuff. If you find that you make consistent mistakes, you don't know what's going on, you're not able to analyze that stuff, bring stuff into someone who can help you look at that kind of stuff. But in reality, we should be able to do all this kind of stuff ourselves. If you don't have time for it, it's a different thing, right? Like, I understand that. Pay someone to do it, whatever. But I think with anything, the more that you know about the stuff that you're using, and the more you're able to maintain it, the better. The less nervous you have to be when you use it. Same for kitchen shit, right? Like, you know how to fix your plancha. Like, you don't give a fuck how you use it. Then you do whatever you need to do, and shit breaks. You're like, I got this, right? So I think learning about everything and feeling comfortable with it is the best, personally speaking. Cool.
Cool.
Sweet.
Cheap one.
Thank you guys. Really
Oh,
appreciate
thank
you having me. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, let me get cleaned up and get